Alrighty, and we are started. Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. We're so excited to welcome Dr. Natasha Myhal, an enrolled member of the Sault Ste. Marie Tribe of Chippewa Indians. Dr. Natasha Myhal is a Provost Fellow, Assistant Professor of Indigenous Environmental Studies at Ohio State University, where she also holds an affiliation with the American Indian Studies program. As a critical Indigenous studies scholar, she engages in the nexus of colonialism, ecology, and treaties as they foreground more than human relatives as a resource, threatened species, and ancestor. Natasha obtained her PhD at the University of Colorado Boulder in critical ethnic studies with a certificate in Native American and Indigenous studies. She works at the cusp of tribal natural resource management and climate change. Her research explores issues of the inherent responsibilities of tribal sovereignty and self-determination, community-centered relational ways of knowing, and unique ecologies of tribal restoration programs. We're very excited to have her here today, and I'm going to go ahead and hand it off to Dr. Myhal. Welcome.
Well, thank you so much, Emily, for that introduction, and thank you to AAG for inviting me to do this webinar. So Buju Natasha Dijnakas, Makwanindo Dem, Bawating Anishinaabe, Ijnakade Ishkonegan Wenjibayan, Bangi Etigo Ninata Anishinaabem. So I just introduced myself in Anishinaabe Moan, or the Anishinaabe language. I shared who I am, my clan, and then also where I'm enrolled, which is the Sault Ste. Marie Tribe of Chippewa Indians. And then the last part is I shared is I only know a little bit of Anishinaabe Moan. And so my Anishinaabe family comes from the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, primarily the St. Ignace area, but I grew up for most of my adult life in Cleveland, Ohio. And so just a bit of a disclaimer as I get started, I represent myself in kind of what I'm going to share today. I don't speak for all Native peoples, nor do I speak for any of the tribes in Michigan. So I think it's important to note that, this is just some of my thoughts and looking forward to kind of hearing your reactions at the end of it. So I'll go ahead and share my screen and we'll get going. Okay, so I am assuming most people could see this, so I'm going to just get right into it. So yeah, like Emily shared, I am a Provost Fellow of Indigenous Environmental Studies at Ohio State, and today in this webinar, we're going to be going over a little bit of the story of the Anishinaabe in Michigan, really around treaty rights and how Anishinaabe have navigated treaty rights, how they're engaged with contemporarily, and then I hope that this discussion around treaty rights, while I can't go into every single treaty in Michigan, will allow you to understand some of the, important, takeaways from these agreements, and that, they are not simply something that are historical documents, but very much continue to shape relationships between tribal members, tribal nations, and federal and state governments. So we'll look very closely at some geographic strategies employed, and then by the end, we'll return back to some conversations around tribal sovereignty. So without further ado, just a roadmap for today. I will share some background with you. We will have a discussion around sovereignty. I'll then transition into some of this historical context of treaties, and spend a bit of time talking about that. And then I'm going to move into some of the contemporary challenges that happened with treaty rights in Michigan. And then, what are some of the impacts that, tribes in Michigan are feeling today. And then I'll kind of end with some takeaways, and then also ways for you all as the audience to engage further with Native-led organizations in Michigan and also engage with many more Native scholars in Michigan. Yeah, that'll be at the end. So just some background, the state of Michigan has a Native American population of more than 240,000 individuals, and there are 12 federally recognized tribes in Michigan. And then the US Census Bureau's 2020 data reveals that Michigan ranks in the top 10 in the nation for Native American populations. And so here's a map of where the contemporary federally recognized tribes of Michigan are located. And so you can see there's many tribes in Michigan. And I always, ask or just suggest to people that, when we're talking about Native history in Michigan, to really consult the tribal government websites. So you can look for the tribal government websites of each of these tribes and read their histories. And so while I'm going to be sharing, a brief history, I encourage you all to look up these tribes, read their histories, which will likely be on their websites. And I do think that tribes are, the best representatives to tell their own story, particularly for, the history of Michigan and contemporary connections. So just some general overview with terminology. Language is really complicated, and I'm going to go through some of the different ways in which you might have seen different Native terminology in Michigan. So the first being Anishinaabe, which there's a translation that means the people, and this refers to Indigenous peoples of the Great Lakes. And they're also sometimes referred to as the Three Fires, which means that they're related linguistically and culturally together. And so we have the Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi. And for the Ojibwe, sometimes you'll see this referred to as Chippewa. And many early explorers and traders had issues with spelling and pronouncing. And so there's definitely many versions and variations of these terms. But for me personally, I prefer either Ojibwe or Anishinaabe. But like I shared earlier, there are many different thoughts from Native peoples on what terms they prefer. So it's always important that you use or you ask a Native person, what is your tribe, or how would you like to be referred to? And then, so we have the Odawa or Ottawa, and they are known as traders. And so they were responsible for providing food and goods. And then the Potawatomi or Bodwadmi were kind of the last to build the fire, and they're known as the younger brother, whereas the Ottawa were the second as part of the Three Fires, and the Ojibwe are the eldest. And so with the Potawatomi, they are responsible for protecting and nurturing the Three Fires. So altogether, there are many relations and then also differences between the Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi. So it's important to acknowledge their distinctions and not to collapse them into one group. And then the last sort of terminology that I think is important for this webinar is clans. And so many tribes have clans, but the Anishinaabe in particular have a clan membership that's often passed down through their families, and it relates to governance, family relationships, and social obligations, and it stems from our animal relatives. So I'm gonna share a Mentimeter with you all, because I'm gonna transition into a discussion on sovereignty. So if you all could please either scan the QR code or use the code and type in what comes to mind when you think or reflect on the term sovereignty.
Natasha, on my screen, it looks a little bit cut off. Could you blow it up again so that we could see that possibly?
Yes, let me see what I can do.
And panelists can also insert the link into the chat if you're able to.
Okay, let me insert the link into the chat and see if that works better because I don't know if I can blow it up. Let me do this. Okay, maybe this will be better. I just put the link in the chat. If that doesn't work, then we can just go old school.
Yes, that should work.
Okay. Well, folks are saying that their chat is disabled.
Okay, everyone, I went ahead and changed the chat functions to everyone.
This works. I don't see anything coming through. I don't know if folks are still having a hard time with it. Let me see. Not seeing the link. Please add the link again. Okay. Is there Emily, I'm sorry. Is there a way to put the link in the Q&A? Because I put it in the, oh, I see you just put it in the chat. Okay. Hopefully folks are getting
Apologies for any technical difficulties.
no. I-
Yeah, Natasha, the link also says view only, so I'm not sure if guests
No,
have editing privileges.
no. Okay, we might just go old school because I don't know why that's not working. Sorry about this, everybody. So if folks could just put in the chat instead of using Mentimeter what sovereignty means to them, I will get my slideshow kind of back up and running here. Okay, Emily, I might need your help for the slide. Okay, so I'm seeing self-determination, freedom, liberation. See monopoly on power of force in a region. Independence and freedom from external control. Right to choose. Oh, we having a lot of responses now. Supreme authority, power to make your own decisions. So thanks all for kind of using the chat function. And so this presentation is really going to kind of talk about sovereignty in many ways. And as you all have kind of indicated from the chat, there are many meanings of sovereignty. And then there are also meanings that are inferred from sovereignty as it relates to treaty rights. And so I've already noted that, the English language is very complicated, and there can be conflicted meanings at times for sovereignty. But more often than not, sovereignty is at the heart of Native nations, what they argue for, and what many of the scholarship within Native and Indigenous studies promotes. So, there's a long history in Michigan of the Anishinaabe. There are multiple creation stories. I'm familiar with two. One is contemporarily known as Mackinac Island, but there's a story that details that this island was formed on the back of a turtle. And then there's also another creation story, or better, migration story, where the Anishinaabe were coming from the east and they were told to stop at a place where food grows on water. And that's known as Monoman, and they arrived in the Great Lakes. And so within our communities, there can be different perspectives on these stories, and there can be variations to these stories as well. But for the most part, these stories do detail to, from, and of a place for the Anishinaabe, and that these detail our political structures that come straight from the land. And these lands hold our stories, and they hold the basis of our knowledge and tell the Anishinaabe who we are. So moving on to Anishinaabe diplomacy. So Anishinaabe peoples have always had their own ways and methods for diplomatic relations. And this is prior to colonization. This is grounded in their worldviews, languages, knowledges, political structures. This is also stemming from our clan system. And then also, these are the early treaties. So this is what I think of prior to the treaties that were made with the federal government. And then I mentioned the clan system, and that is the Anishinaabeg's political structure is based off of that. And these clans connect families to particular animal nations and territories where these relationships were more formalized. And animal nations themselves were often referred to as political nations, and they are a source of knowledge and inspiration. And moreover, the Anishinaabe in the Great Lakes were often interacting with other tribal nations and used their worldviews to implement reciprocity, diplomacy, and this was formalized in treaties with other nations. One that's commonly known and referred to as the dish with one spoon that was made with the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. And this detailed, how the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee would take care of a shared territory while still maintaining their independent status. So a lot of how I think about Anishinaabe diplomacy and how many Anishinaabe scholars also write about it, such as Leanne Simpson. And I have one of her articles on this slide, is that treaties are a relationship. And so these traditional treaties were based on that. But of course, with the arrival of settlers, this brought a fundamental, different approach and shift to treaties that I will get into next. So during the 18th and 19th century, there were numerous treaties signed that led to the creation of the state of Michigan. A total of 11 treaties were signed, and then in particular for Detroit, 1807 was a treaty that was made between the Ojibwe, Potawatomi, and Ottawa, and that is kind of shown in the green on your screen. And today I'll primarily be talking about the Treaty of 1836, which is highlighted in yellow, both in the lower and upper peninsula. And so there were many reasons for treaties that were negotiated between the Anishinaabe and the government. But one of the, through lines that you might be able to infer is that the Anishinaabe wanted to stay in their homelands. They wanted to avoid removal. But Michigan was also a part of removal, and most folks might be aware of the Trail of Tears, in which the Cherokee were removed to Oklahoma, but Michigan also has a dark history, and this is referred to the Potawatomi Trail of Death. And this was a 660-mile journey to Kansas by 860 members of the Potawatomi Nation in 1838. And I'm going to read a quote from the director of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation Cultural Heritage Center, Kelly Mostler. And it reads, quote, "Our Trail of Death got its moniker because over the 660 miles that we were forced to walk from northern Indiana toward the new reservation in Kansas, around 40 tribal members died. We were forced out at the end of a gun. They did not want to negotiate with us to stay, so it was a forced removal," end quote. And so a lot of these treaties and removal policies were followed by forced attempts at assimilation and then also further land loss. And so what happened with many of the treaties is that millions of acres were ceded to form the state of Michigan, and particularly with the Treaty of 1836, 16 million acres of land in the Upper and Lower Peninsula were ceded, and this led to the recognition of the state the next year in 1837. And it was understood that reservation lands would be chosen within those ceded lands. And then within treaties, there were often a promise of continuation of hunting and fishing rights, which we'll talk to today, or education and money and services. And so many of these treaties were not favorable for the Anishinaabe. So often, this was the best that the Anishinaabe could do while acting under duress. In particular, with the 1836 treaty, I've already mentioned that this led to statehood for Michigan in 1837, and this treaty makes up 40% of the current land base within the state of Michigan. And without this land, Michigan territory would not have been granted statehood and would not have been able to enter into the Union. And so despite these treaties guaranteeing rights and protections, there were still further policies that happened that were designed to further dispossess Anishinaabe in Michigan and disrupt their ways of life. And one such policy was the 1887 Dawes Allotment Act, which had the goal of assimilating Native peoples into American society and economy through private land ownership. And this eventually led to a shift from subsistence work to more wage work. But I want to be clear here that this didn't mean that Native peoples gave up their subsistence practices. In some cases, they adapted to both. And so there was an agency of the Anishinaabe continuing their subsistence practices while also engaging in wage work. And then just want to make note of, one of the bigger industries at the time in Michigan that was harmful, and it was lumbering. And this was, another strategy to open up land. And this was happening roughly from the 1860s to 1910. And of course, the arrival of railroads helped to expedite and open it up. There was lumbering operations that were set up near Native reservations, so it came with an increased risk for Anishinaabe communities. But at the same time, the Anishinaabe did participate in this industry. And at times, they did participate in this industry and were wanting to establish their own sawmills, but they weren't able to do that. And were often blocked at a federal level from doing so. And so there was a lot of economic exploitation of Native lands through various industries, such as lumbering. But at the same time, we also see a cultural sovereignty attack. And this was through the boarding school system. And so these were operated by federal governments and churches. And this was really the aim to strip Native children of their culture and train them for either manual or domestic labor. One of the founders of the boarding school, United States Army officer Richard Henry Pratt, is often quoted for saying, kill the Indian, save the man. And so he was kind of the, he created this system, and it stems from the military. And in Michigan, there are 8 total boarding schools, and the biggest being Mount Pleasant Indian Industrial School, which is located in Mount Pleasant, Michigan. And I wanted to share this briefly with you all. And I know that, primarily this talk is on treaty rights, but I think it's important to know that these schools were also rooted in federal policy, and they continue to impact our communities today. And while, boarding schools were devastating, there are many stories of resistance, such as the children who attended and survived. And our communities aren't defined by this, but it does have an impact on most Native people. And part of this, discussion around allotment and assimilation is to show you that Anishinaabe people were experiencing assimilation on all fronts. So now we're going to move into some of the challenges around treaty rights. So I've already mentioned that, land was depleted from settler exploitation, lumbering. There weren't many forests left in Michigan. Many Native people had to move into more migrant work. Meaning they were picking blueberries, cherries, digging potatoes, working as fishing hands and agricultural laborers. And then also during this time, so this is like the 1950s, so I am jumping ahead a bit, we are seeing an increase in tourism in Michigan. So many affluent Michigan residents are, either moving up to northern Michigan or spending their summers in northern Michigan, and this also changes the land use patterns. But at the same time, we do see the state of Michigan imposing state hunting and fishing regulations. But nationally, we're seeing a lot of activism. There are many minority groups at the time asserting their voice in the civil rights movement. And then also we're seeing fishing advocacy happening in the Pacific Northwest with the Fish-ins. And so we are seeing a lot of these issues come more and more into the public eye and receiving widespread attention. And so eventually these treaty rights disputes are making their way towards Michigan, and then they end up, primarily taking place in the courts. And so there are multiple Native individuals who took their treaty rights to court. This is by no means an exhaustive list, but these are a couple folks who have been written about. We have William John Drew, who's Ojibwe from Lance, and he was fighting against being subjected to state laws. And part of what he was persecuted for was he didn't want to waste fish by throwing dead lake trout back into the water when he lifted his nets. So he was actually successful in citing a treaty, specifically one that was made in 1854. So he did win his case, but there are many but there weren't a lot of bands that signed that particular treaty, so the impacts of his victory were somewhat limited. And then we have Arthur Duhamel, who's Ottawa from Pishabastown near Traverse City. He was arrested several times for treaty rights violations. He served jail time. He never had his fishing equipment returned. And he was also often targeted by vigilantes who are trying to intimidate him. And so the targeting by, vigilantes and the harassment was very common for many Native fishermen during this time. And so, often local courts wouldn't look favorably upon Native fishermen. So it was hard often to receive justice through the local courts. And then probably the most, I don't want to say famous, but maybe the most well-known story is that of Albert LeBlanc, or otherwise known as Big Abe. And he is a Bay Mills Ojibwe fisherman. And he had a case that had to deal with commercial fishing. He had help with legal services up in the Upper Peninsula. And it was found in the People versus LeBlanc that the present day descendants of the Chippewa and Ojibwe bands, specifically from the Treaty of 1836 in Washington, still had their rights to fish. And the state could only limit those rights when and if they proved that native fishermen were endangering the resource. So at this time, there were a lot of native fishermen using gill nets, and there was a lot of backlash from non-native fishermen who thought that this was endangering fishing populations. But again, the state ruled that the state could only ban gill nets if there was a threat to the fish generally, and if the Indians themselves were like this practice was threatening the fish. So eventually, this was the case that made it to the Supreme Court. So it laid a much bigger groundwork and a unified legal strategy to help solidify treaty rights for the Anishinaabe in Michigan. And if you're interested in reading more on this topic, I highly recommend Disputed Waters by Robert Doherty. And that's kind of where I'm pulling from in this particular slide. And so we see that for the Bay Mills case, it eventually was ruled U.S. versus the state of Michigan. So there were tribal leaders from the Upper Peninsula, the Sault Ste. Marie tribe, the Grand Traverse Band, joined this case, and they pressured the courts. The Native American Rights Fund also joined this case, and they really wanted their trust responsibilities recognized. So this case began in 1973, but it wasn't settled until 1985. So there was a long time of kind of waiting. And there was, obviously uncertainty for what might happen. But, during this time, there was many anti-Indian sentiments from sports fishermen. The state, was acting on the assumption that they would receive a victory. And so there was a lot of, false narratives kind of circulating that treaty rights were an environmental threat, claiming that native gill netters would wipe out lake trout stocks, and that there was this need for oversight, state oversight on tribal nations. But what ended up happening was federal Indian law or Indian law, where many attorneys who were arguing these cases had to rely on professional historians and anthropologists who helped depict historical events to help win their case. And so it was later ruled by Judge Fox that we did not give up the right to hunt and fish, and we didn't give up these rights specifically in the Treaty of 1836, and there was a later treaty in 1855. And so meaning that the tribes and tribal members could continue to fish within their traditional waters for any species that they wished, as long as they obeyed tribal and federal regulations. So this was a really significant legal victory, and this implementation did require additional negotiations between tribal and state interests. So this, after this case was ruled in favor of the tribes, it didn't mean that everything was okay per se. And what actually happened was this particular case led to what's known as the Great Lakes Consent Decrees. And so the judge effectively curbed state oversight and affirmed tribal sovereignty, but often people reflect on if these consent decrees are in fact justice, because on the ground there were still issues of control that needed to be worked out between the state, sports fishermen, and there was, state politicians who were advocating against tribal fishing rights. And so these consent decrees were a means for the state and native tribes to talk out their differences. And that's kind of how the consent decrees came into play. And so there was different user groups for the consent decrees, and the fishery was essentially split up into zones, and different tribes were allocated control over these different fishing zones. So specifically for the 2000 Great Lakes Consent Decree, it is an agreement that governs allocation, management, and regulation of state and tribal fisheries. And they also have an inland consent decree, which concerns inland lakes in Michigan, but I won't have time to get into that. And so the consent decree was signed in August of 2000 by the Bay Mills Indian Community, the Grand Traverse Band of Ottawa and Chippewa Indians, the Little River Band of Ottawa Indians, the Little Traverse Bay Bands of Odawa Indians, the Sault Ste. Marie Tribe of Chippewa Indians. And it was set to expire in August of 2020, but it was extended and remains in place as the parties are often having to negotiate like a new agreement. And so there is a new consent decree in place and new regulations as of 2023. So if you go to the website on the slide, you can see some of the regulations and the maps that depict the zones of fishing. And then the map in front of you just shows that the Treaty of 1836 is one of two treaties that are subject to fishing by tribes, and the other one is the Treaty of La Pointe, which is signed in 1842, which covers primarily the western Upper Peninsula and then also areas of northern Wisconsin. So now that we have these consent decrees in place, there are still contemporary impacts that Native peoples are having to grapple with and tribal communities are having to face in Michigan today. And so while there have been many important legal victories and there are many protections for treaty rights, there are now concerns around invasive species, warming waters, and forever chemicals that are impacting treaty rights and abilities for Anishinaabe peoples to successfully practice their subsistence practices. And so now a question that is kind of circulating within scholarship and also within conversations amongst tribes is that, can treaty rights be used and to advocate for climate change protections? And so I have a citation there by Elizabeth Cronk Warner, who's also a member of the Sault Ste. Marie Tribe of Chippewa Indians, and she raises the question in this piece, whether treaty rights can be used to require the United States government to protect tribes that are threatened by climate change. And so this is actually something that's really interesting to think about because the United States government has to act in the best interests of tribes because there's a federal trust responsibility that exists. And these treaty rights are generally supposed to exist in perpetuity. But if we have these threats, such as the ones listed on this slide, then that is a real concern whether or not they will actually last into perpetuity. So as to my knowledge and from the article, there haven't necessarily been any success from tribes on this front, but it is interesting to think about that, how treaty rights can be used to push for assistance from the federal government to alleviate some of these negative impacts that tribes are already facing. And so this is really, some of the contemporary challenges and manifestations of sovereignty and how it intersects with treaty rights, particularly climate change, and it's shaping, many tribal nations and individuals from being able to practice their subsistence. And so I want to end with some final takeaways. So as we've seen through this journey from pre-contact treaty relationships to these legal battles that I've briefly gone over, Anishinaabe sovereignty has never been surrendered. It's only been constantly renegotiated in changing contexts, often within the courts. And, today's challenges of environmental degradation and climate change represent another new chapter where treaty rights are again at risk. But again, we see that the Anishinaabe are continuing to adapt And that, this isn't just a legal concept for the Anishinaabe, but a living practice, and one that relies heavily on place. And so, looking forward with lessons from the past, we see that treaties that were signed by our ancestors were not meant to be static documents, but these are frameworks for ongoing relationships. And so as tribes continue to navigate some of these challenges today, some of the early principles of diplomacy, such as reciprocity, respect, shared responsibility, are even more vital. And we know that our ancestors secured these rights not just for themselves, but for future generations. And so that's why, I'm inspired to continue to do this work in my role. And then also, I want to emphasize resilience and adaptation. So we've seen in this presentation how the Anishinaabe were subject to many strategies of dispossession, removal, assimilation, resource exploitation, legal battles. But at each stage, the communities found ways to adapt, maintain our culture and our connections to place. And so, this same resiliency and adaptation informs, conversations around environmental threats today. And so this is an ongoing narrative of persistence. And so I began this introduction, sharing who I am as an Anishinaabe person. And, while some of these terms throughout the presentation may have sounded like abstract legal concepts, such as sovereignty, treaty rights, or even consent decrees, this is a very deeply personal for many tribal citizens. These are the foundations that continue to allow us to fish, hunt, and gather, and also help us maintain our responsibilities from our creation stories. And so when there's advocacy for treaty rights, which that is always ongoing, they're not just arguing for these legal technicalities per se, but fighting for continued existence of these rights and, more importantly, of these relationships. So as you all have joined today, there's many Anishinaabe scholars and who are also, I would say, experts in this area and other areas. And so, I have a list here, and it's by no means exhaustive, but these are just some folks that I often think with. I just want to point out that Angie Sanchez at the top is an AAG member. And she's someone that I work with closely. And then we have Kyle White, Matthew Fletcher. We have Eric Hemingway, and he's a tribal historic preservation officer. And then we have some more Potawatomi scholars, all at Michigan State. So Blair Morrisseau and Elon Pushedley. So I'd encourage you to look up their bios, look up their work, and engage with that, and also share that with your network. And then also, support and learn from these organizations listed here. So the first one is the Sacred Waters Collective, which works on reclaiming traditional birth and parenting practices. We have Miigwech Inc., which is an educational and outreach group, and they host workshops, small group teachings, and foster understandings of creativity and encourage growth. And so they often support Indigenous women, children, families, work directly with Indigenous communities, help to build awareness. So they're another organization that I'd recommend to check out. Also, I'd recommend you all to look up the United Tribes of Michigan. They're a quasi-political group comprised of Michigan tribal nations, elected tribal leadership, and they advocate for Indigenous issues. And some recent legislative protection that has been passed is one where the naming of monomen or wild rice is the state grain for Michigan, and then also the protection for Native American students to wear regalia at graduation. And then we also have the Tribal Legislative Liaison Office, which is housed within the state of Michigan's government, and this is a recent change. So I put that there as something that you can read up on. And then the last sort of organization, or this is more or less like a blog, is it's called Turtle Talk, and it's actually run by Matthew Fletcher, who's at the University of Michigan. And this is a legal resource where there's often many resources shared around Michigan, around tribal sovereignty, but it also goes beyond and looks at, tribal sovereignty issues across the United States. So also a place for you to continue to look and learn from. And then there's just some additional references here that I pulled from and that I think are really helpful to kind of paint this broader context of Anishinaabe treaty rights, but by no means is it exhaustive. And then with that, I will just end here and just say miigwech. Thank you all for coming, and I'm gonna stop sharing, and I think we can move into Q&A.
Thank you so much, Natasha. That was an amazing presentation. For everyone who is here, we are now open for Q&A. We do have a couple of ways of doing that. If you would like to verbally ask Natasha a question, you can go ahead and raise your hand and I can open up speaking privileges. You can go ahead and put it in the webinar chat or the question and answer section of the Zoom as well. So we'll go ahead and wait to see if anyone has any. It was so incredibly informative. Thank you again.
Oh yeah, no, thank you. And thank you all for coming. I see a lot of thank yous in the chat. So much appreciated. And yeah, I'm happy to answer any questions or any thoughts from folks.
A question. I was curious about actually, we'll go to Guntram first.
Okay.
They have put a question in the Q&A box.
Okay.
They ask, given that a large share of Native Americans live in urban areas, what Anishinaabe resistance/resilience actions are currently happening in Detroit?
Oh, that's a great question. And something I wasn't able to get to in this presentation, but I would actually probably point you towards Angie Sanchez, because she's someone that I kind of rely on for, some of the contemporary or more urban-based actions that are happening. So I would actually, encourage you to reach out to her, and I can also, work with her and kind of get some resources shared before the annual meeting. But yeah, I'm sorry I can't answer that kind of more specifically. But yeah, you are right that there are a large share of Native Americans that are in urban areas. And so, yeah, it's important to kind of get those resources kind of shared a little bit more openly.
Thank you. We have one in the chat from Deborah. They state Michigan is a pretty diverse state, and you indicated that there are different tribal treaty regions. How do these different regions interact, and are there different tribal right conflicts in different parts of the state?
Yeah, I mean that's a great question, and obviously I could probably talk at length for that one. And so, I would probably approach it, obviously there are many different treaty regions by the map that I shared. And they also, interact in different ways. I do think at times there can be sort of ongoing conversations between tribal nations themselves. I can't speak to specifics because I'm not, I'm not a part of tribal government, but you can look up, particularly, it's called the Chippewa Ottawa Resource Authority, and it's how tribes in Michigan kind of work together to navigate some of these conflicts or kind of work to make sure like the different jurisdictional zones are managed properly. And, you know, I think with a lot of these contemporary challenges that are uh, facing a lot of Native communities, but particularly in Michigan, there's definitely, conversations that are happening from tribal governments on these topics. So yeah, I would start with the Chippewa Ottawa Resource Authority, and then also another counterpart, which some Michigan tribes are a part of, but not many, is the um, Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission. It's called GLIFWIC. So that's one that'll have a lot of resources and kind of narratives and what are some of the contemporary conflicts that might be happening.
Thank you. We have another question from Dahlia. They asked if you can elaborate more on how the tourism industry has impacted local Native tribes. They're currently in a class on global tourism and environmental justice, and they're discussing concepts such as disaster tourism and reconstructed ethnicity.
Mm. Very interesting. Yeah, so this is an area that I'm not one of my areas of specialty, but I do find that it's often referenced in a lot of the literature that I read, that because there's so much tourism happening in northern Michigan, um, it's impacting, the ability for Anishinaabe peoples to fish, access to sites. There's a lot of, vacation homes that are built up right along the shorelines. And so that, impacts, access to different lakes and inland waters. And then also, I mentioned like sports fishermen. That's a huge tourist industry. And, I think that might be, I can't say for sure, but that one might be one of the bigger ones that are impacting the Anishinaabe, just in the ways in which, sports tourism and those sort of, you know, I guess ethics or morals behind sports tourism kind of differ than what we see in subsistence and certain practices such as that. But I do, I've never heard of the concepts disaster tourism and reconstructed ethnicity. So that's really interesting that you're in a class that's, going over that. Um, and yeah, I do think, you know, like I said in the presentation that, the increase in tourism has impacted shifts and changes within the landscape. So we see a lot more like, um, yeah, a lot more economies centered on tourism, such as like cherries is a big one in northern Michigan and Traverse City. So we see a lot of, this move towards orchards, that are being, promoted. And then, there's less sort of a emphasis on subsistence, or I guess less access for it, I would say. But yeah, so thank you for that question.
Thank you. We have one more comment from Guntram. They said that they're going to try to connect with you at AG. They're currently working on a book project with an Ottawa elder about Native Mackinac. So keep an eye out for them there. And then me and Katie had a very similar question. So we'll go ahead and end on this. Are there other Indigenous food gathering practices beyond fishing and or places protected under treaty rights?
Yeah, so I primarily talked about fishing, but there is hunting and gathering that are also protected under treaty rights, and those would fall under the treaty, the 11 treaties that were signed in Michigan. So it falls, yeah, there are many Indigenous food practices that fall under treaty right protections. So yeah, another hunting, and then, gathering of medicines and plants would also fall under that. And I didn't get, a chance to talk about it, but that some of the more contemporary ways in which, those fall into the consent decrees is with the inland consent decree. So that's how that has been kind of negotiated contemporarily.
Amazing. Thank you so much for spending the last hour with us. This has been an amazing talk for everyone. This webinar has been recorded and we'll work on getting that up on the AAG website. Also, Natasha will be joining us at the annual meeting in Detroit this March. She'll be joining Patricia Urkamp in the presidential plenary. So we are so excited to welcome her during this time. And until then, thank you so much for everyone for attending. And we look forward to our next webinar that will be on March 5th. So thank you and have a great day.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.